At 7:42 on a cold September morning in 1944, a wooden glider with the nose of a bird and the skin of a coffin slid through the Dutch sky without a sound. Sergeant Thomas Blackwood, 23 years old, son of a Yorkshire sheep farmer and rejected fighter pilot, kept his hands locked on the control column as if he could crush his own fear by gripping harder. The tow rope that had dragged them from England was gone. There was no engine, no second chance, nothing but air under thin plywood wings and 15 lives in the hull behind him. Arnhem lay ahead somewhere under the thin sheet of cloud and smoke, and with every second the ground climbed toward them, patient and inevitable. His left eye burned. It always did when he focused too long without blinking. That eye had cost him his dream of a Spitfire cockpit, the medical officer tapping the chart and shaking his head while Thomas stood at attention, feeling his future fold in on itself. The glider pilot regiment had been the only door left open. Wooden aircraft, no parachutes, land once and fight as infantry. Even the paratroopers laughed at them. He could still hear one of them at Harwell, just before takeoff, voiced loud enough for everyone to hear. Hope the wooden wonder up front knows which way is down. The men in the fuselage had laughed, and Thomas had smiled stiffly, because what else could he do? Now there was no laughter. Behind the thin plywood bulkhead, 15 men sat and swayed with every bump of invisible turbulence. He could picture them clearly without turning his head. Corporal Rhys Davies, 29, tough Welsh miner with a jaw like carved stone, second time dropping into enemy lines. Private Jennings, 19, red-haired and freckled, who had written his name and his fiancée's initials on the stock of his rifle in shaky letters during the briefing. MacLeod, the quiet Scotsman who had stood in the corner humming a tune under his breath, while everyone else checked magazines and grenades. There were others, two brothers from Manchester, a former butcher from Birmingham, a grammar school teacher who double-checked the map with Thomas, tracing the route with an ink-stained finger. A jeep and a 6-pounder anti-tank gun were lashed to the floor at the rear. All of it rested on glue, nails, and faith. To the right of Thomas, in the co-pilot's seat, Sergeant Ed Hartwell flexed his fingers and glanced at the altimeter. Ed was 2 years older, from Devon, a man who had spent his life plowing fields, fixing tractors, and breaking in horses. Gliders suited him, no engine noise, just air and nerve. He had the sort of calm that made officers like him and priests trust him. Now his lips were pressed into a thin line. They had flown together enough times for Thomas to know that meant worrying, not panic. Worrying could be managed, panic killed. Wind shifting, Ed said quietly. She's pulling right. Thomas adjusted the rudder with careful pressure, feeling the glider respond sluggishly. The air was different here, more treacherous, full of the invisible scars of artillery blasts and rising heat from burning farms. The briefing maps had shown neat rectangles of green fields labeled Landing Zone South, Landing Zone North, little ink arrows leading to the bridge over the Rhine. In the air, those lines were meaningless. There were only shapes, shadows, smoke, and flashes of light where anti-aircraft batteries reached for the sky. Below, black bursts of flak appeared and vanished, each one a tiny flower of metal fragments that could turn thin plywood into kindling. The main stream of gliders had released further west and were already dropping like seeds into the Dutch countryside. Thomas had kept his horse on the far edge of the formation, using every sliver of advantage the training instructors had hammered into him. Do not be predictable, do not fly straight, do not give the enemy an easy angle. His hands moved without conscious thought, small corrections, small defiance against the immense fact of gravity. Through the windscreen, he caught a glimpse of another glider crossing their path, wings flexing under strain. A second later a flak shell detonated just ahead of it. The nose disintegrated. The fuselage folded around nothing. Tiny black shapes tumbled out, men, weapons, fragments of wood. The broken glider spun away, a slow-motion nightmare, trailing splinters. Thomas tightened his jaw until his teeth hurt and kept flying. There was nothing he could do. He had been taught this early. You fly your own machine, not the one that is already falling. Release in 30 seconds, Ed murmured, eyes on the dead sky where the tow plane had been only a minute earlier. The Halifax had given them height, speed, and noise. Now there was nothing between the horse and the ground but air, judgment, and a slip of ink on a briefing map. A tiny green light glowed above the panel. The release had already happened. They were on their own. Thomas checked his compass, then the field patterns below. He should have seen the long, broad swath of landing zone south, where dozens of gliders were meant to arrive in quick succession. Instead, he saw a ragged patchwork of fields, and in the middle distance, smoke rising in lazy columns. As he banked slightly for a better view, the truth snapped into focus. Landing zone south was a mess. Gliders crisscrossed each other at strange angles, some intact, some shattered, some burning. Men ran in frantic patterns, ant-like, pushing jeeps, hauling crates, dragging wounded into ditches. Muzzle flashes flickered along a line of trees. He could almost see the arcs of tracer fire sweeping across open grass. They were late. The sky and the flak and the tow plane's brief evasive detour had cost them precious minutes. The landing area that had looked so clean and safe in the sand model back in England was now a killing ground. He could land there anyway. He could follow the plan, drop into the chaos, hope the wheels found empty space between wrecks. They might survive the impact, and then the German machine guns would have their turn. The regiment instructors' voices echoed in his head. "You are responsible for the men you carry. They are not cargo. They are lives." "What do you think?" Eddie asked. It was barely a question. They had rehearsed it. Primary landing zone compromised. Use your judgment. Thomas looked left. Smoke, wreckage, flashes of gunfire. He looked right. Beyond a line of hedgerows, close to a cluster of red-roofed farmhouses, lay a long narrow field. It was bordered by a dense hedge on one side and a line of posts and barbed wire on the other. No gliders, no obvious troops. It was closer to Arnhem itself than the planners would have liked, deeper into the unknown. And from this height, he could not see what might be hidden along its edges. If he chose wrong, he would kill 15 men in one stroke. If he chose right, they might all die slower under machine gun fire at landing zone south. The math of war was always cruel. He lowered the nose, turning away from the designated landing zone. It felt like stepping off a cliff. "We go for the narrow field," he said, finding his voice. "Closer to the bridge, less flak. If there is trouble, we hit it fast and hard." Ed said nothing, but his knuckles whitened on the yoke for a moment, then relaxed. "Agreement enough." Behind the bulkhead, Davies's voice cut through the fuselage. "Brace for landing, heads down, teeth together. If you are praying, pray short." The field spread out in front of them, filling the windscreen. Thomas felt the glider sink, the way a bird becomes heavier in his imagination when it stops beating its wings. Airspeed bled away. He needed to thread a 70-foot plywood box between a hedge and barbed wire at a shallow angle, in a crosswind, in a machine that would only ever land once. At 10 meters, he flared, lifting the nose slightly. The hedgerow rushed past on the left, close enough to touch. The wheels scraped soil, bounced, then bit. For a heartbeat, Thomas thought he had an ugly but survivable landing. Then the left wingtip clipped a wooden post. The world bucked sideways. The glider pivoted brutally, tail swinging around, fuselage twisting. Wood shrieked. Screws tore free. The cargo lashing snapped with gunshot cracks. The metal nose smashed into the earth and sheared off, glass shattered in a glittering sheet. Thomas felt his shoulder tear, a white-hot wrench as the joint gave out. His head hit the panel. Light exploded behind his eyes. Sound vanished. For a second he was weightless. No up, no down, only motion. Then the cockpit section stopped with a jaw-snapping jolt that drove the air from his lungs and left him gasping like a fish. Silence. Then sound rushed back, layered and confusing groans, shouts, the ticking of cooling metal, somewhere a scream that cut off mid-note. Thomas fought his way toward consciousness. Pain everywhere, cold air on his face, blood in his mouth. He opened his eyes. The cockpit had torn away from the rest of the glider and lay tilted in the churned soil. The windscreen was gone. The right side panel hung open like a broken jaw. Through the jagged gap behind him he could see the torn interior of the fuselage, shadows moving amid splintered wood and twisted metal. Ed sagged in his harness, head lolling. There was blood on his forehead, but his chest rose and fell. Alive for now, Thomas tried to lift his hands. His right arm moved sluggishly, his left hung dead, blazing agony through his side. Dislocated. He had seen enough training accidents to recognize the shape under his flight suit. Each breath stabbed. He gritted his teeth and unbuckled with one hand, nearly falling out of the seat as gravity reasserted itself. He braced his boots against the angled floor and dragged himself toward the open windscreen frame, sucking air past bruised ribs. Outside, the field lay in chaos. The rear half of the glider had carved a brutal path through the barbed wire fence, splintering posts and coiling wire like tangled snakes. The torn fuselage had plowed forward another 20 meters and come to rest in a shallow depression, right on top of a German machine gun position. For a moment Thomas did not understand what he was seeing. The earthworks were obvious now: shallow trench, sandbagged front, dark rectangle of a firing slit disguised by brush. Through the ripped-open mess of plywood and earth he could see the barrel of a gun bent almost double, metal warped, ammunition belts scattered like dull brass confetti. 2 bodies lay half-buried under shattered wood, field gray uniforms stained darker. A third sprawled face down where the jeep had finally slammed to a halt, the vehicle's bumper crushing his ribs. A fourth hung from the shredded edge of the trench, boots dangling, helmet missing. The horse had landed like a hammer directly on the nest. Its broken weight had smashed the MG position flat. Behind Thomas, voices rose: Davies shouting orders, someone sobbing, another voice speaking German in a wet choking gurgle that faded quickly. Thomas blinked hard. His brain refused to hold the dual truth at once. He had made a catastrophic landing. His catastrophic landing had destroyed a machine gun that would have raked landing zone south and the approach to Arnhem Road. He dropped down from the cockpit, boots slipping in churned mud, and staggered toward the rear. Splinters tore at his flight suit. He stepped over a torn seat, a broken rifle, a pool of something dark he refused to identify. The air smelled of petrol, fresh earth, and blood. Inside what remained of the fuselage, Davies knelt in the wreckage, hands slick with someone else's life. 2 bodies lay still at his knees. One had a jagged length of plywood through his chest, ribs lifted in a grotesque arch. The other's neck bent at an impossible angle. Others were moving: Jennings, face white, one hand gripping a twisted rib of metal for balance. McLeod, already dragging a dazed comrade toward the jagged opening, his own arm hanging at a bad angle. Davies looked up at Thomas. His eyes were hard, assessing, not accusing. "You still with us, pilot?" Thomas swallowed. His voice came out hoarse. "How many?" "13, including you." "2 are gone." Davies jerked his head toward the dead. His tone stayed level. He had done this before. Thomas's stomach lurched. To lives gone because he had chosen the narrow field. To not being shot out of the sky over landing zone south. The arithmetic refused to resolve cleanly. Outside, he heard a single crack of rifle fire, distant but sharp, followed by another. War had not paused to let them take inventory. Davies's gaze flicked past Thomas, out to the crushed machine gun nest. "They had this field covered," he muttered. MG-42, perfect angle on the approach. "If we had landed as planned," he did not finish. He did not need to. Everyone in the wreckage could imagine the tracers reaching out, chewing through plywood, flesh, bone. The crash had killed them roughly but quickly. The gun they had destroyed would have killed dozens more, slowly. One of the younger soldiers, a boy with a barely there mustache, stumbled toward the opening and stared down at the destroyed position. "Bloody hell," he whispered. "You landed on them." "Not exactly in the manual," someone else muttered, a flicker of dark humor in the wreckage. Thomas felt something twist inside him: shame, relief, disbelief mixed into one toxic knot. They had laughed back in England about glider pilots who could not land. If word ever got out about this, the joke would be too perfect, too cruel. There was no time for spiraling thoughts. Davies snapped his fingers for attention. "Listen up, we are closer to Arnhem than the rest. That means closer to the bridge. We do not sit here waiting for a German patrol to come finish what gravity started." He pointed at Thomas. "Pilot, what is the distance to the bridge from here?" Thomas forced his mind to move through the fog. "About 3 kilometers, maybe less. If we follow the drainage ditch east, then cut through the orchard near the farmhouses, we can avoid the main road." He pictured the map, overlaying it on the real ground. "But we have no radio, no contact. We do not know if 2nd Battalion made it. We know there is a war on," Davies said flatly. "That is enough. We are going to the bridge, as ordered. That is what we were brought here for." He gave Thomas a longer look now, weighing him. "Can you fight?" Thomas flexed his right hand around the grip of his revolver. His left arm throbbed in savage pulses. "I can shoot," he said. "I can walk." "Then you are infantry now." Davies straightened. "Get the jeep out from that mess. Load the bad ones. Scrounge guns and ammo from the Germans if you have to. We move in 10 minutes. The next 40 minutes blurred into motion. They manhandled the jeep free of the wreckage, its front bumper bent, one headlamp dangling. The engine coughed, sputtered, then caught. They hauled Eddie into the back, his left leg clearly broken into places. A Medic, the grammar school teacher turned makeshift sawbone, splinted it with 2 pieces of glider rib and a length of signal cable. Thomas found himself kneeling beside the crushed machine gun nest. One of the German gunners lay half buried, eyes open, staring at nothing. He could not have been more than 20. A small photograph had fallen from his tunic pocket, a young woman and a toddler, smiling awkwardly at the camera. Thomas's right hand shook as he picked it up. There were no words in any language sufficient to address the absurdity of it. He slid the photograph and the man's identification tags into a small pouch on his belt without fully understanding why. When they rolled out of the field, past the wrecked glider and the torn barbed wire, Thomas sat in the passenger seat of the jeep, revolver in his lap, map in his head. His left arm hung useless at his side. Every bump sent pain up into his neck. Davies drove with tight focus, jaw clenched, eyes scanning the hedges. The surviving infantrymen moved on foot, fanning out, rifles ready. Within minutes, the quiet fields gave way to war. The first mortar burst landed far to their right, a column of earth erupting near a copse of trees. The second landed closer. By the third, Davies had swung the jeep off the dirt track and into a rough drainage ditch, its wheels throwing mud. Out, he yelled, and men bailed, diving into the shallow cover as more shells walked methodically across the landscape. Thomas slid down behind a clump of reeds, pressing his back to the wet earth. The sound was overwhelming crump of explosions, shrapnel whining overhead, the distant rising chorus of machine guns and shouting in the direction of landing zone south. McLeod dropped in beside him, breathing hard, eyes wide. This was meant to be a quick war-ending stroll, McLeod said between breaths. Drop in, take the bridge, hold 2 days, home for Christmas. That is what they told us. Maybe they misplaced the calendar, Thomas said, surprising himself with the words. They tasted bitter and kept him from thinking too hard. The mortar fire eased. In the gap, small arms fire picked up from ahead. A German patrol, drawn by the crash or the movement. Davies gestured, hand chopping forward, and the surviving airborne men pressed on, trading cover for speed. They came upon the enemy at the edge of an orchard, apples lying bruised on the ground where shells had shaken them from branches. 3 Germans, then 5, then more, shapes flickering between trunks. The firefight was sudden, vicious, and short. Sten guns and rifles cracked. An enemy machine pistol chattered in bursts, clipping leaves and branches, snapping one-man Kendall. The butcher turned paratrooper backward into the dirt. Thomas fired his revolver twice, not entirely sure at what, just where muzzle flashes flickered. 1 German rushed a fallen British soldier, bayonet lowered. Jennings stepped into his path and fired from the hip, the recoil nearly knocking him over, but the German went down. Within a minute, it was over. The orchard smelled of cordite and crushed fruit. Flies already circled the first bodies. Davies checked each fallen man with a quick, practiced glance. We cannot carry them, he said of the dead. We mark them in our heads and tell someone later, if later exists. The phrase lodged in Thomas's mind, if later exists. They pushed on toward Arnhem. The city did not look like the war zone Thomas had imagined from the air, not at first. Streets lined with tidy brick houses, small shops with hand-painted signs, bicycles leaning against fences. Dutch civilians peered from curtains, faces pale and wary. A woman in a faded blue dress stepped onto a doorstep holding a white cloth in both hands, like a flag she was not brave enough to raise fully. Children watched from an upstairs window, eyes enormous. Somewhere a dog barked nonstop. As they passed, hands appeared, waving cautiously. Someone called out something in Dutch. Jennings, who knew a handful of phrases from a girlfriend back home, shouted back that the British were here, that it would be over soon. The leap passed easily through the air. People wanted to believe it. A man in a gray coat pressed a loaf of bread into Davies's hands and pointed toward the river, then made a cutting motion at his own throat. Sure, he said. Very heavy Germans. We figured that part, Davies muttered. Gunfire snapped down the street. Everyone dropped. A German sniper, high in a church tower, silenced a second later by a burst from someone's Bren gun. The city was peeling back its civilian coat to reveal the scars beneath. By late afternoon, Thomas and his little convoy had merged into a larger stream, the tail of 2nd Battalion, 3rd Parachute Brigade, moving toward the bridge under the command of Lieutenant Colonel John Frost. Frost was lean, steel-eyed, and carried himself like a man who had already accepted that his name might end up carved on a stone in this foreign town. He listened to Davies's breathless report about the crash, the destroyed machine gun, the alternate approach. His gaze flicked once to Thomas's useless arm and the blood drying on his face, then returned to the map spread across a bonnet. "You have done your part and then some," Frost said simply. "Stay with us. Every rifle will matter." Thomas nodded. No one mentioned the crash. No one had time to laugh or curse. They were beyond that now. They reached the northern ramp of the Arnhem Bridge just as the sky was staining orange. The steel arcs loomed above them, graceful and cold, cables rising like the ribs of some skeletal beast. On the far bank, as tiny as toys, Thomas could make out dark-shaped vehicles, men, specks of movement. The Germans had not expected the British to reach this far. Not yet. They would, very soon. Frost's men fanned into surrounding buildings, houses, a school, a cafe, a row of warehouses along the riverfront. They set up firing positions in windows, knocked holes between basement walls to create covered movement routes, dragged furniture into barricades. Arnhem's residents watched with a stunned mix of hope and fear. An old man insisted on bringing a kettle of tea to the men on the first floor of a townhouse overlooking the ramp, ignoring the incoming fire that chipped brick above his head. Thomas found himself assigned to a school building on the eastern side of the bridge, its chalkboards still covered with arithmetic problems and Dutch script. He, Jennings, McLeod, and two paratroopers from another glider crew took positions in the second-floor classroom, windows overlooking the approach road. The desks had been stacked into a rough barricade. Textbooks lay scattered where children had dropped them in haste days earlier. A medic with a steady hand and a tired face popped Thomas's shoulder back into place in a side room. The pain was instant and blinding, a white flash that drove him to his knees. When it passed, his left arm hung heavy but usable, wrapped in a makeshift sling. The medic gave him a small dose of morphine and 2 hard biscuits. "Do not waste either," he said dryly. Night fell with the slow, reluctant fade of late September. The first German probing attacks came shortly after dark, small groups testing the riverbank, bursts of automatic fire from the south shore. Frost's men answered with disciplined volleys, pinning them down. Somewhere across the river, a tank engine revved, then another. Armored silhouettes shifted like squat beasts in the gloom. The siege began. For Thomas, those days collapsed into a sequence of snapshots, each crystal clear and floating in a fog of exhaustion. A tank on the far bank opened fire, its shells smashing into the building next to the school, sending dust and shards of brick in through the windows. A private named Ellis sang softly under his breath, some music hall tune, every time he reloaded his rifle. Dutch civilians sheltered in the school cellar. One old woman insisted on peeling potatoes for the men upstairs, as if feeding them could somehow keep the shells from finding them. Jennings, usually restless and chatty, grew quieter with each passing hour, his humor shrinking to a thin, fragile thread. They slept in 10-minute fragments, cheek on stone, fingers still wrapped around weapons. The building shook constantly. Glass turned to powder, plaster rained down. Every time Thomas closed his eyes, he saw the twisted bodies in the machine gun nest, the bent German gun, the young face on the identification photograph he had taken. He told himself the crash had saved lives, but the doubt crept in anyway. If he had landed cleanly somewhere else, would Eddie's legs still be intact? Would those 2 British bodies in the wreckage still be breathing? War did not answer such questions, it only demanded more of them. On the 3rd day, food began to run low. They rationed biscuits, shared tins of stew between 5 men. Water had to be carried under fire from a damaged main. Ammunition dwindled faster than anything. Every missed shot felt like a crime. Thomas found himself counting rounds in his revolver with pathological attention, checking and rechecking, as if arithmetic could ward off death. That afternoon, while the sky glowed with the dirty orange of distant fires, Davies climbed the classroom stairs, ducking instinctively as a shell burst rattled the roof. His face was streaked with grime, eyes bloodshot. He sank down beside Thomas behind the desk barricade and passed a dented enamel mug of something hot that tasted vaguely like tea and stew combined. You still beating yourself up? Davies asked without preamble. Thomas stared at the road outside, where a burned-out vehicle smoked quietly. We lost 2 on landing, he said. If I had chosen landing zone south, we would probably all be dead from that MG-42, Davies cut in, or from the mortar on the main drop, or from the tank I saw chewing through gliders this morning. You are crediting yourself with more control than any of us really have. He took the mug back, draining it. You made a call. It saved my life. It killed 2 others. That is war. It does not make you a hero or a villain. It just makes you one of us. I did not mean to save anyone, Thomas said softly. I meant to land. That is all. Davies gave a humorless half-smile. Most of us did not mean to become anything we became here. Heroes by accident, cowards by exhaustion, murderers by orders. If we live, some chap in London will draw arrows on a map and write a paragraph in a report. And none of it will show that you were shaking so hard you nearly dropped the yoke when the flak started. He nudged Thomas's hand with his boot. You did not drop it, by the way. Remember that part. Before Thomas could answer, a shout came from downstairs. Tanks, approaching from the south. They crowded to the firing slits, hearts beating in sync with distant engines. German armored half-tracks and a pair of tanks rolled toward the northern end of the bridge, guns turning like eyes. The first tank fired, the shell screaming overhead and detonating somewhere behind them with a sound that made Thomas's teeth ache. British anti-tank teams answered from hidden basements and alleys. One shot went wide, another struck home, blooming a flower of fire on the far side of the bridge. Men cheered reflexively. The reprieve was brief. The Germans adapted quickly. They shelled buildings methodically, floor by floor, turning houses into skeletal shells. Flamethrower teams moved in under the cover of armor, washing basements with fire. The air filled with the stench of burning wood and something worse. Dutch civilians prayed aloud in the school cellar, clutching rosaries, one old man repeating the same sentence in Dutch over and over until his voice cracked. On the 5th night, Jennings cornered Thomas in the wrecked classroom as the sound of artillery thumped like a distant, monstrous heartbeat. The young private's hands shook. I had a dream, Jennings said, staring at the chalkboard where half-erased sums still lingered. I was back home, train station, you know? The one by the river. I was supposed to be meeting Linda there, but the platform was empty. Then I realized everyone was already on the train. They were shouting at me to get aboard, but I could not move. My boots were stuck in the tracks. And the train kept going. He swallowed. Do you think we will get out? Thomas hesitated. The honest answer was, he did not know. The bridge was a shrinking island of British resistance in a rising sea of German steel. The radio reports from further west were fragmented. Relief that was supposed to arrive in 48 hours had bogged down miles away. High Command's careful timings had unraveled under the weight of real roads, real rivers, real resistance. Yes, he heard himself say not all of us. But some. He could not explain the strange conviction that threaded through the word. Maybe it was defiance. Maybe it was just the need for someone to say it aloud. Jennings nodded slowly, as if he knew there was more, and said, If I die, and you get out, he said quietly, tell Linda I was not scared at the end. Tell her I did not run. You think I am going to hunt down a girl in Liverpool just to lie to her? Thomas tried for a smile. It came out crooked. If you die, Jennings, I will tell her you were the bravest soldier in Arnhem. Even if I have to write it in the paper. Jennings snorted. Bravest idiot, maybe? Then he looked out toward the shattered skyline. If we live, nobody back home is going to believe any of this, are they? Thomas thought of the sand table models, the neat arrows, the briefing officer's confident smile. They will believe whatever fits in a paragraph, he said. And forget the rest. As if to underline the point, a shell smashed into the side of the school, collapsing part of the roof. Dust filled the classroom. They hit the floor together, coughing, ears ringing. When the dust thinned, one of the desks had been split into by a chunk of roof tile. The chalkboard lay face down, obliterating the half-done sums. By the 7th day, the defenders were down to a handful of buildings near the bridge. The school had been abandoned when a direct hit fell through the top floor, killing 2 men in an instant. Thomas, Davies, Jennings, MacLeod, and a shrinking circle of others fell back to a row of warehouses by the water. They moved like old men, each step an argument between will and worn-out muscles. Ed died on the 8th day, Infection claimed him. The medic could do nothing more with dirty bandages and a dwindling supply of morphine. Thomas sat with him in a corner of the warehouse, listening to his partner's breath grow shallow. Eddie's hand, rough from years of farm work, gripped Thomas's forearm with surprising strength. "Remember that field in training," Eddie murmured. "The one with the ditch and the stone wall at the end. You nearly put us through the farmer's kitchen," Thomas remembered. A practice landing gone slightly long, the horse bumping hard and sliding, Thomas wrestling the controls and Eddie swearing cheerfully as they skidded to a stop 3 meters from an astonished cow. They had laughed until their sides hurt, adrenaline and relief mixing into giddy hysteria. "You were better than you thought," Eddie went on, "better than most. Do not spend the rest of your life thinking you only ever crashed." His eyes fluttered. "Promise." Thomas swallowed the lump in his throat. "I promise." Eddie's grip loosened. His chest rose, fell, and did not rise again. When they carried his body to a makeshift corner where other dead lay, wrapped in whatever cloth was at hand, Thomas felt the promise settle on him like another weight on top of all the others. He had not asked for it. He would not drop it. On the 9th night, frost hinted at the edges of puddles in the broken streets. The defenders were almost out of ammunition. German loudspeakers blared offers of honorable surrender in English and Dutch. Frost and his officers refused. Instead, a plan whispered through the dark like contraband: withdrawal, not a retreat, a river crossing. South, under cover of darkness, across the broad, cold water of the Rhine, boats, rafts, anything that floated. It was madness, but it was also the only path that did not end with capture or wholesale slaughter. Thomas listened in a damp cellar as Davies relayed the orders. "Only those who can move," Davies said grimly. "They are leaving some of the worst wounded. There are not enough boats." The words fell like a fresh burst of shrapnel. Leave the worst wounded. Men who had held on through 9 days of hell, now to be abandoned in the ruins of Arnhem. Jennings's face crumpled. "We cannot just," he started. Thomas cut him off gently. "If we try to carry everyone, we lose everyone," he said. "Some of them cannot survive the crossing anyway. They know it." Davies's eyes were flint. "You think I like it?" he asked. "You think the colonel liked signing that order? We are at the point where every choice is wrong. That is what defeat looks like up close." They formed up in small, shadowed groups, moving out through the shattered backstreets. Dutch civilians slipped from doorways, pressing hands, muttering blessings. One old woman thrust a small silver cross into Thomas's hand, closing his fingers around it so tightly his knuckles ached. "For luck," she whispered in halting English. He wanted to tell her that luck had already had its say. Instead, he tucked the cross into the same pouch that held the German photo and tags. The weight of mementos grew. At the riverbank, the scene teetered on the edge of panic. Men clustered in the dark, shapes barely distinguished from the black water. Engineers and boat crews whispered names and numbers, trying to impose order. German flares arced into the sky, bathing the far bank in ghastly white light. Machine guns spat from the southern shore. Bullets whipped the water into dancing spurts. "Go," someone shouted. A cluster of men shoved a wooden assault boat into the river. It rocked, overloaded, but held. Another went in, then another. Some men lashed doors and planks together, improvised rafts. Others simply stepped into the water and started swimming, boots and gear dragging them down. Thomas, Davies, Jennings, and McLeod ended up together in the third boat, knees pressed to ribs in the cramped hull. The oars bit into the black water. Cold seeped through boots and trousers into bone. Thomas could not feel his fingers. Halfway across, a machine gun found them. Water leapt in hard little explosions around the boat, bullets stitching lines. A man near the bow jerked, then slumped, falling overboard without a sound. For a second, the boat rocked dangerously. Davies leaned toward the falling body on instinct, hand reaching. Thomas grabbed his sleeve with his right hand, dragging him back. "Leave him," he rasped. The words tasted like poison. The man was already gone, slipping under, carried by the river. Davies stared at him for a heartbeat, then nodded once, jaw clenched. They rowed harder, the cold bit deeper. Thomas's left shoulder screamed with each jolt, but he dug in with his right, feeling muscles burn. Survival had narrowed to this: keep the boat pointing forward, keep it from flipping, reach the far bank. They did. Mud sucked at their boots as they scrambled up the southern shore, fingers clawing for purchase. Hands reached down from the darkness above other British soldiers, ones who had never made it to the bridge but had fought their own battles west of Arnhem. They hauled the river crossers up, slapping shoulders, checking faces. Some cried openly, whether from relief, shock, or cold no one could say. When someone finally counted, the numbers were brutal. Out of roughly 10,000 who had gone in at Arnhem, fewer than a quarter made it out across the river. The rest were dead or prisoners. Operation Market Garden had failed. The bridge they had clung to for 9 days remained in German hands. For Thomas, the war did not end at Arnhem. He spent weeks in a field hospital, his body trying to catch up with what his mind had already endured. Infection nipped at his wounds but did not take hold. Nightmares did. He woke sweating, heart pounding, certain that the machine gun's barrel was still pointed at his chest or that the wooden floor of the glider was about to turn to splinters beneath him. The army sent him back to England and reassigned him to a training wing. He stood in front of younger men, pointing at blackboard diagrams of approach paths, stall speeds, crosswind corrections. The trainees watched him with a mix of awe and apprehension. Word had spread. This was the man whose crash had destroyed a machine gun nest at Arnhem. Some called it daring, some called it luck. None knew about the two dead in the wreckage, Eddie's fading breath, or the German photo he still carried. At night, in barracks quieter than any place had a right to be after Arnhem, Thomas wrote letters. To the families of the two men who had died on landing, he described courage, not splinters. To Eddie's parents, he spoke of calm bravery and steady humor, not of promises made to a dying man. To Jennings's fiancée in Liverpool, because Jennings did not make it through the river crossing, cut down on the bank by a burst of machine gun fire, Thomas wrote that her man had died fighting, not afraid, thinking of her. It was not the whole truth. On the riverbank, Jennings had been shouting curses at the darkness, nothing about home on his lips. But Thomas remembered their conversation in the classroom, the train dream, the request. He gave her the version the boy had asked for. After the war, he went back to Yorkshire. The farm had not changed much. The hills were the same, the wind cut through the same. His father had aged 10 years and 3. His mother cried when she saw him and then slapped his shoulder for taking so long to come home. He tried working the land again, mending fences, lambing in spring, cutting hay in summer. The rhythm of seasons soothed something raw inside him. Yet every time a plane droned overhead, his shoulders tightened. He took to glancing up at the sky reflexively, judging altitude and approach, even when it was just a passenger aircraft far above. The Distinguished Flying Cross arrived by post one gray January morning, accompanied by a formal letter praising his skill and bravery in delivering troops to their objective under heavy fire and for his conduct during the defense of Arnhem Bridge. He set the medal on the mantelpiece for a week, staring at it whenever he passed, feeling the mismatch between the neat ribbon and the mess in his head. Finally, he tucked it into a drawer alongside the German photo, the identification tags, and the tiny silver cross the Dutch woman had pressed into his hand. The objects lay together, a small, private archive of things that did not fit in official citations. Years went by. He married a woman named Margaret, a nurse who had spent the war in a different kind of trenches, hospitals, wards, endless nights of holding hands and listening to last breaths. They had 3 children. When the kids asked about the medal in the drawer, he gave them broad strokes. Airborne. Holland. A hard landing. He did not describe the way the machine gun nest had looked under the broken glider, or the way the old school's chalk dust mixed with plaster dust and fear. Occasionally, men from his unit visited. Davies came once in the early 50s, still wiry, eyes a bit softer. They sat in the kitchen, drinking strong tea, and talked around the subject of Arnhem for an hour about the train journey to the coast, the taste of Dutch bread shared in a ruined street, the way frost had formed on the inside of windows during the siege. At the end, just before he left, Davies put a hand on Thomas's good shoulder. "You know, they talk about that crash as if it was some sort of planned maneuver," he said, half amused. "I heard some passing it around as a story for recruits how Sergeant Blackwood used his Horsa as a battering ram to take out a German gun. Makes us sound like gods of war." He smirked. "If only they knew you were just desperately trying not to hit a hedge." Thomas laughed, a surprised bark that turned into a cough. "Let them have their story," he said. "Better that than the truth, which is that I lost control and luck did the rest. Davies shook his head. You had enough control to move away from landing zone south. You had enough control to be there, not somewhere worse. Luck does not operate in a vacuum. At night, when the house was quiet and the wind scraped branches against the windows, Thomas sometimes took the little pouch from the drawer and laid its contents on the table. The German photo, the ID tags, letters worn smooth. The silver cross, the medal. He arranged them and rearranged them, as if some pattern might emerge that would tell him what kind of man he had been. In 1994, for the 50th anniversary of Operation Market Garden, an invitation arrived from a veterans association. There would be a ceremony at Arnhem, wreaths, speeches, ceremonies on the bridge itself. Dutch locals had turned parts of the battlefield into memorials. The letter mentioned a historian who had traced the path of a particular glider that had famously destroyed a German machine gun nest on landing. They wanted Thomas to see the field. He almost threw the letter away. The idea of going back felt like picking at a scar. But Margaret, wise in ways that did not need war to sharpen them, put a hand on his arm. You have carried this on your own for 50 years, she said. Maybe it is time to let the ground carry some of it again. They went. Arnhem was different and the same. New houses filled old gaps. Trees had grown where walls had been. The bridge gleamed, modern and mended, cables taut. On the riverbank, flags flapped gently. Young soldiers in neat uniforms stood at attention next to men with gray hair and walking sticks. The historian, a Dutchman in his 40s with a notebook full of maps and a reverence that bordered on awkward, took Thomas and a small group out to the site of the crash. The field was smaller than Thomas remembered and larger, the edges blurred by half a century of seasons. Cows grazed nearby, indifferent. A simple stone marker stood near the hedgerow, engraved with a few names: the 2 British who had died on landing, the 4 Germans in the nest, and a short inscription in Dutch and English. At the bottom, someone had carved a sentence: in this field, enemy and ally were equal under falling wood and iron. Thomas limped to the stone, leaned on his cane, and read the words twice. Equal under falling wood and iron. It was as close to the truth as anything official had come. He knelt slowly, knees complaining, and placed his hand flat on the sun-warmed granite. For a moment, he saw it all again: the splinters, the bent gun, the young German's face. He heard Davies shouting, felt the lurch of the glider, smelled the mix of fuel and blood. His throat tightened. I did not mean to kill you, he murmured, not caring if the others heard or not. Any of you, ours or yours. The wind sighed through the grass. A cow flicked its tail. The world, as always, moved on. That evening, at a gathering in a local hall, a reporter with a notepad and eager eyes approached him. She had read the historian's notes, seen the citation. What did it feel like, she asked, to turn your glider into a weapon like that? To save so many men with one landing? Thomas looked at her for a long moment. In her expression he saw the hunger for narrative, for clean heroism. People always wanted a story that made sense. They wanted gods of war, not scared 23-year-olds with sweat-soaked hands. It felt, he said slowly, like losing control of the machine and doing my best not to kill the men behind me. He paused. It felt like fear and impact, and then realizing that something terrible had also done something good. That is not heroism. That is just what war is. He held her gaze. It makes fools of plans and legends out of accidents. She wrote something down anyway. Later, the article would speak of courage, of a daring crash that silenced a deadly gun. People would nod, satisfied. The truth, messier, quieter, tangled with guilt and relief, would stay with Thomas. He died in his sleep in 2003, in the same farmhouse where he had watched the Battle of Britain streak across the sky as a boy. His children found the pouch in the drawer when they sorted his things. They recognized the medal. The rest took longer to understand. Eventually, they donated the contents to a small museum in the Netherlands, which built a modest display: a photo of a young German soldier, British tags, a silver cross, a map fragment annotated in a firm hand. Visitors read the caption and moved on. A few lingered. Fewer still felt, in that quiet corner, some echo of the day when a wooden glider fell out of the sky in just the right wrong place, silencing a gun and rewriting the fates of men who had laughed at the pilot, not knowing that in a few brutal seconds his failure would become their salvation. History books mention Arnhem in paragraphs: Operation Market Garden, airborne drop, failed attempt to secure the Rhine. They seldom mention the single glider that hit a hedge wrong, the way its shattered nose buried itself in a machine gun nest, or the 23-year-old at the controls who spent the rest of his life carrying the weight of that impact. Yet in that small Dutch field, in the minds of those who walked away from the wreckage, it was as significant as any bridge. It was the moment they learned that in war, the line between disaster and miracle is as thin as a sheet of plywood, and sometimes, when wood meets iron at the right angle, even a crash can be an act of grace. If this story reminded you why these men deserve to be remembered, hit that like button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, or if you had family who served in World War II. Every comment keeps these stories alive. Subscribe to the channel so we can keep bringing you the forgotten battles, the unsung heroes, and the impossible choices that shaped history. And please, share this video with someone who loves real history, the kind that doesn't fit neatly into textbooks. The kind that shows us courage and failure are sometimes separated by nothing more than a few meters of barbed wire and the weight of a wooden glider falling in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. These men flew into hell with no engines and no second chances. The least we can do is make sure their stories don't disappear into silence.